Welcome to this short lecture on price controls, focusing on ceilings and floors in markets. This opening slide shows the basic supply and demand interaction and the graphical idea of a price, ceiling, and floor, so keep that image in mind as we explore how legal limits alter market outcomes and create unintended trade-offs between efficiency, equity, and stability. On this slide, we define key terms. A price ceiling is a legally imposed maximum price, and a price floor is a legal minimum. The diagram here also introduces the idea of binding versus non-binding controls, meaning some limits change the market equilibrium, while others leave it unaffected, which is a crucial distinction when evaluating policy effects. Here we look at the consequences of an effective price ceiling using the supply and demand chart on the left and real-world examples on the right. When a ceiling sits below equilibrium, it creates excess demand, leading to shortages, queues, rationing, black markets, and often declining quality, as seen historically in gasoline lines and persistent rent control shortages. This case study on rent control uses a supply and demand graph to show how a rent cap reduces the quantity of housing supplied relative to demand. The practical outcomes include reduced landlord revenue, cutbacks in maintenance, halted new construction and conversions of units, which together produce a long-lasting shortage that may ultimately harm the intended beneficiaries. A price floor above equilibrium creates the opposite problem: surplus supply. The chart illustrates excess goods that remain unsold, forcing government purchases, storage, or disposal. Those actions shift costs onto taxpayers, can keep some producers idle despite higher nominal prices, and generally cause inefficiencies and fiscal burdens while distorting market signals over time. Minimum wage is a familiar example of a labor market price floor, shown here with the typical job quantity contraction when wages are pushed above equilibrium. The result can be concentrated unemployment among young and unskilled workers, and the debate centers on trade-offs between higher pay for retained workers versus potential lost opportunities and incentives for automation. This slide compares how price elasticity shapes shortages and surpluses, contrasting inelastic demand like gasoline with highly elastic demand for luxury farm goods. When demand is inelastic, ceilings hardly lower quantity but sharply cut producer revenue, whereas floors with elastic demand can halve sales and shrink producer profits, highlighting the policy lesson that elasticity estimation matters for expected impacts. Price controls do not operate in a vacuum, and this diagram explains incidence and shifting burdens. Legal assignment may intend to help buyers or sellers, but actual economic incidence depends on elasticities, market power, and enforcement. Those factors determine who ultimately gains or loses and how costs flow between consumers, producers, and the public purse. The EU Common Agricultural Policy case study shows how guaranteed price floors for grains, dairy, and meat produce persistent surpluses that were stored, exported with subsidies, or destroyed. The slide links those outcomes to stakeholder impacts like stable farmer incomes, higher consumer prices, and environmental costs, and explains why reforms move toward decoupled payments. Two cautionary episodes illustrate the risks of ignoring equilibrium: California's 2000 electricity crisis and large fuel subsidies in Nigeria. In both cases, controls kept retail prices out of step with costs, shrinking supply, creating shortages or smuggling, and ultimately straining infrastructure and public finances, underscoring how equilibrium disruption can cascade through networks. To weigh interventions, we must balance efficiency goals against equity and stability, and distinguish immediate visible benefits from slower costs like shortages and quality decline. The analytical framework on this slide reminds us to consider changes in surplus, fiscal and administrative burdens, and long-run dynamic effects such as innovation and human capital responses before endorsing controls. When controls are unavoidable, strategic implementation matters. Phase measures in gradually and target them narrowly, and always pair price limits with supply-side responses like housing mandates, wage subsidies, or transferable quotas. Finally, include retreat and review mechanisms such as transparent sunset clauses and periodic elasticity assessments, so policymakers can adjust or remove controls as conditions change.